Hi everyone, this is Dr. Erica Pearson, and I want to talk to you today about a topic that I'm very passionate about and that I've picked up in many of my patients actually, and that's thiamine deficiency, particularly in my patients with special needs. Down syndrome is an area that I specialize in, and the applications of thiamine deficiency in autism have also become very evident to me in the research that I've done, and I wanted to share with you today what I've learned. So what I'm going to talk to you today about are these topics. I am going to touch just briefly on history of thiamine deficiency. I find the means by which thiamine deficiency was discovered really interesting and somewhat relevant to the epidemic of autism that we have today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about biochemistry. It's my background. I have taught cell biology to college students at a university, and teaching is another passion of mine, and so I can't get away with not teaching a bit of biochemistry today. And so then certainly I'll get into some practical topics that are going to be most helpful to practitioners and parents here looking at the causes of thiamine deficiency, signs and symptoms, and then certainly the connections to autism, Down syndrome, and others. I have a couple of really interesting cases to present to you to show you how addressing a thiamine deficiency can improve the development in children. Treatment options, certainly we're not just giving thiamine, we're giving specific forms of thiamine, looking at root cause, etc. And then a little bit about the prognosis, reversibility of thiamine deficiency, because it does impact brain development, and so can we heal the brain after a thiamine deficiency? So to start talking about the history here, a lot of the information I have here came from this specific article. If this topic is interesting to you, I highly recommend you take a look at this. It was a really fascinating read. For me, it was great to get a little bit away from the biochemistry and just read the history of Beriberi, which is thiamine deficiency. It's similar to other conditions that you may have heard of that are rooted in a vitamin deficiency, like scurvy is vitamin C deficiency, pellagra is B3 deficiency, and so Beriberi is thiamine deficiency. And thiamine, as an aside, is of course B1. And so this happened in India and Southeast Asia during the late 1700s to early 1800s, and wasn't actually fully resolved or uncovered until the 1940s, 1960s, and still occurs today actually, particularly in lower income areas, undeveloped areas of Southeast Asia. So Beriberi, of course, first actually described as early as 1629 by Jacob de Bont, who was a Dutch physician. And then the first English account was given in the late 1790s to early 1800s. So this is where it was first started to really be explored, and it was really fascinating reading the process that they went through in order to uncover the root cause of this problem. It was most often seen in China, Japan, Indonesia, and India. So there was something sort of endemic or something specific to these areas. So what they found was, it was in 1910, Henry Fraser, he first stated in his papers that the researchers conclusively showed that beriberi can be prevented by the use of unpolished rice and is surely produced by the use of highly polished rice. So it was the rice consumption that is very high in China, Japan, Indonesia, and India, and still is today. Right, so I want families who are perhaps joining this summit from all over the world. We have patients here at the Pearson Center for Children who are in China and parts of Southeast Asia, and rice consumption is a question I often have. And so what they did, by polishing the rice, they were removing the hull where the B1 is contained within the whole grain, and what they were left with this polished rice is a very large source of glucose, actually, without the B1 that is needed to metabolize the glucose, and I'll get into some of the biochemistry there shortly. Just showing a quick map of the areas of red here where this beriberi was most noted. It was at the time called the Oriental Plague. It was very devastating to the area. Thousands of people died. It was the #1 cause of infant mortality in the area as well. So it was a significant problem for them, of course. Right there it is, the leading cause of infant mortality in the Philippines during the 1920s and the 1930s. And it wasn't until the 1940s, many, many years later, hundreds of years later, that thiamine deficiency was recognized to be the actual cause. And decline in beriberi wasn't apparent until the 1960s. So to this day, in developed countries, in the US, etc., they add thiamine to processed grains in order to prevent beriberi. But the question many of us have who are looking at thiamine deficiency today is, one, is it enough? And is the consumption of sugar, particularly in the US diets, sort of overcoming the supplemented thiamine that is found in processed grains and flours? So since the 1870s, there have been a rapid growth of mechanized rice milling. Instead of dehusking, right, by hand, rice was now processed by power-driven mills, which along with the husk, removed the inner skin or pericarp, the grain, then being further buffeted to produce a polished white appearance. And then in removing the thiamine contained in the pericarp, milling exposed consumers whose diet consisted mostly entirely of white rice to the risk of beriberi. So the concern I have today certainly is that many families who are choosing gluten-free diets then replace the gluten in their diet with a lot of rice. Rice crackers, gluten-free breads are very high in rice, and I'll talk about another problem that rice comes with in a moment in terms of causes of beriberi. But I am concerned about overconsumption of rice. So, of course, many families are now, probably exacerbated, frustrated. We think, well, now what can we eat? Certainly gluten, that's a whole nother topic, should be removed for some children, but finding some other source other than high consumption of rice is definitely recommended. So a lot of the history, a lot of the information I talk about here today comes from the work of Dr. Derek Lonsdale. If you're looking to read more about thiamine deficiency, I highly recommend you look up his work. I'll be citing some things here today. He was a practitioner in pediatrics at the Cleveland Clinic for many years. He headed the section of biochemical genetics at the clinic. And in 1982 is when he decided to shift his practice. He's written a book about the process he went through to start practicing a more holistic, natural, integrative approach for his patients. And so he started the preventative medicine group to specialize in nutrient-based therapy. He's written over 100 published papers, and the conclusions support the idea that healing comes from the body itself rather than from external medical interventions. And this is what many of us naturopathic, functional medicine doctors are following as well. And he used the term high-calorie malnutrition, which many would argue that many people in the U.S. are currently experiencing, lots of calories, sugary drinks, but lacking in the actual nutrition, vitamins and minerals that are needed to, process those high doses of glucose. And so if you're looking for more articles written by Dr. Lonsdale, hormonesmatter.com is a website where many of his work is today. So again, a bit of biochemistry is where I'm going to start here. This is just a brief overview and a reminder of cellular metabolism. Again, this is extremely brief. Cellular metabolism is a complicated process, and I'm going to do my best to break it down and explain to certainly those parents who are listening today and watching. We get glucose, right? This ringed structure from many sources within our diet. It doesn't have to be sugar. It can be apples, carrots, right? Glucose is high in vegetables as well. And through a process called of glycolysis, that glucose is broken down into what is called pyruvate. And pyruvate is a molecule that needs to enter the mitochondria in order to further be used for energy. So this membrane here represents the cell itself, and then this squiggly organelle here is the mitochondria. And mitochondria are main generators of energy within the cell. And so briefly too, when I talk about energy, this is a really important concept for brain health. Our brain is our #1 consumer of glucose within the body. The highest metabolism of any organ within the body, one might think, would be the heart or muscles or something, but the brain is our most highly metabolic organ within the body, constantly working, constantly clearing out toxins and waste and processing neurotransmitters, etc. And so this energy metabolism is extremely important for the brain. So pyruvate is transported into the cell where it's used to produce acetyl-CoA, and then that is further broken down into metabolites through what's called a citric acid cycle. I'll get into that briefly in a moment. And then electrons from that citric acid cycle are transported by NADH through what's called the respiratory chain or oxidative phosphorylation, where we get lots and lots and lots of ATP. And then the byproducts of carbon dioxide is a byproduct, but oxygen is converted to water. So this is just a basic reminder, certainly for physicians out there watching as well. So thiamine biochemistry, it's one of 8 B vitamins, B1, and the key here is it's a cofactor for enzymes. So enzymes within our body are what are doing the work of our body, converting one compound to the next. And in that conversion of one compound to the next, certainly within the glucose metabolism is where we get energy. And so these cofactors are not only important for these enzyme functions, but they're necessary for these enzymes to function. And so B1 happens to be involved in several enzymes involved in energy production. Those enzymes, I'll explain in a moment here, specifically are trans-ketolase, pyruvate dehydrogenase, alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, and branched chain alpha-keto acid dehydrogenase. I'll explain each of these in a moment. B1 often works together with other cofactors, right? These enzymes are often very complicated. I'll show you particularly pyruvate dehydrogenase is one I'm going to focus on, and I'll show you later how these enzymes can be quite complex and often require multiple cofactors. Specifically, B1 works together with riboflavin and alpha-lipoic acid. So the metabolic pathways requiring thiamine pyrophosphate. Now, thiamine pyrophosphate is the active form of thiamine that is needed for these processes to occur. So when you take a supplement that is just thiamine hydrochloride, thiamine mononitrate, that's not actually active thiamine. It needs to be converted. And so thiamine pyrophosphate is the compound that we really want, certainly within the brain. And the rest of the body. And so this is needed for here's the trans-ketolase enzyme that I mentioned previously, the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme here, again, that moves pyruvate within the cell, converting it to acetyl-CoA. And then thiamine pyrophosphate is needed for alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. These are 2 key steps, 2 main points in energy metabolism within the cell are these 2 enzymes that happen to both be dependent on thiamine. And of course, the branched chain alpha-keto dehydrogenase enzyme that converts branched chain alpha-keto acids to branched chain acetyl-CoA. And so I've placed all these arrows here. The X's, of course, are blocking out thiamine. I'll talk about causes of thiamine in a little bit, but just so you understand the implications here are what we're going to see. Certainly here with the pyruvate dehydrogenase, we will see a decrease in acetyl-CoA. We'll see a decrease in acetyl-CoA also from the blocking of this enzyme here. And we will see an increase in alpha-ketoglutarate, an increase in branched chain alpha-keto acids, and an increase in branched chain amino acids. I'll explain that the testing that we use here is usually organic acid urine testing to look for these metabolites within the urine. We'll see an increase in pyruvate and an increase in lactate. Lactate is also known as lactic acid. If you've ever had a hard workout and your muscles are sore the next day, that's lactic acid that is built up within your body because by working out your body, you've kind of stressed these energy metabolism pathways. Perhaps there was a lack of oxygen from your heart and lungs not keeping up from that workout. And that soreness in the muscles is no different than what a child or a person with a thiamine deficiency would experience from not even working out. And so we'll see a decrease in this glycolysis metabolite, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, in the presence of a thiamine deficiency as well. So another complicated image here, but to show you, to break it down here, here we have thiamine entering the cell. This blue circle here is a representation of a cell, and of course glucose being very important here as well. So they both enter the cell, and then 80% of thiamine is converted into active thiamine pyrophosphate. And here you see the mitochondria are yellow. There's that pyruvate dehydrogenase. There's that alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, two key steps in the mitochondrial production of energy. And then glucose, of course, is converted here to pyruvate and can be converted into lactate if the pyruvate is not then moved within the mitochondria. Another process here that I'll talk about more in a moment is the pentose phosphate pathway. This is an alternative pathway to glycolysis where the production of NADPH occurs, and again I'll get into this in a little bit more simplified fashion. And so this pentose phosphate pathway is not one to be ignored as well in terms of its dependence on thiamine, which is represented by the little green dots here within the transketolase enzyme. Now in terms of labs, I'll talk about that a little bit and how to detect a thiamine deficiency. It's no longer available in the US or anywhere in Europe that I'm aware of, is a red blood cell transketolase level, which is really what's helpful in determining a thiamine deficiency, but unfortunately it's no longer available. So that enzyme, pyruvate dehydrogenase, now this is a really important enzyme, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. It's a key step in glucose metabolism, and there are some genetic defects that can occur here within this enzyme that are really important to take note. It's a very large enzyme. It's actually often called pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. It has 3 subunits, E1, E2, and E3, and each of its subunits has its own cofactor. E1 is dependent on thiamine, and of course lipoic acid is a cofactor for subunit E2, and then riboflavin, which is B2, is a cofactor for subunit E3. And so this enzyme specifically, I'll get into this in a moment, is inhibited by arsenic and mercury. And I'll talk about sources of arsenic, but many of you may already know that this is where the problem with overconsumption of rice comes from. Rice can unfortunately be a significant source of arsenic, so I'll talk about some research behind that. But this enzyme is specifically inhibited by arsenic and mercury as well. It's a very large enzyme. This is a 3-dimensional representation of what it looks like. Here we see the E1, E2, and E3 subunits. There are 60 E1 subunits in one pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So just to give you a sense of how large this is. And recall that thiamine is the cofactor for the E1 subunit, and riboflavin is the cofactor for the E3 subunit. Alpha lipoic acid is the cofactor here for E2, and how thiamine and alpha lipoic acid may potentially play a more significant role in the function of pyruvate dehydrogenase. Riboflavin is important, but a thiamine deficiency can much more strongly kind of drive the dysfunction of this enzyme. And this, I love these images. These are scanning electron micrographs of actual pyruvate dehydrogenase enzymes, and so we see a confirmation of this shape within this scanning electron micrograph. Okay, so a complicated biochemical image here. What we've done here, I'll go back, is kind of isolated just one of these subunit pieces and pulled it out here to depict the E1, E2, and E3 subunits and how they come together. And what you want to look at here again is there's that thiamine pyrophosphate, TPP. There's thiamine, there's the arrow pointing to thiamine. Of course, riboflavin is the cofactor for the E3 subunit, as I mentioned. Alpha lipoic acid is the cofactor for the E2 subunit. And we also have some other enzymes, vitamins, coming into play here. Pantothenic acid is B5, nicotinamide is B3, of course. But again, this thiamine pyrophosphate is our focus today, and important to see how it helps this enzyme function. So alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, I mentioned earlier, is the other key step in glucose metabolism within the mitochondria. You'll recognize some of these terms here. It also has 3 subunits with their own cofactors. This one, I could not find any research on mercury, but it is inhibited by arsenic. So they are structurally almost identical to one another. Alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase is what this is. This has the same subunit E1, E2, and E3, dependent on thiamine, alpha-lipoic acid, and riboflavin. So it's interesting to me that they are identical, and if I dove into more chemistry here and some evolution, we might see why that occurs. And so just another image here confirming the similarities. Pyruvate dehydrogenase, of course, is converting pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Alpha-ketoglutarate is converted to succinyl-CoA here within the citric acid cycle, but they both produce NADH as an outcome as well, which is an important energy carrier for the second half of mitochondrial function. So that's the pyruvate dehydrogenase and alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase complex. Here we see with the 3 orange circles, alpha-lipoic acid, riboflavin, and thiamine being the cofactors here. Acetyl-CoA, being the beginning point, as it were, for the citric acid cycle. But not to be ignored here is this pentose phosphate pathway. Of course, transketolase is one of the key enzymes within this pathway, dependent on riboflavin. And so what this pathway does, not only does it, I neglected to add an arrow here, not only does it circle around and bring some intermediates here back into the glycolysis pathway, but it also produces nucleic acids and NADPH. And this is what I want to pause on here. This NADPH is, again, not to be underappreciated. It is needed for glutathione regeneration. Many of you are familiar with what glutathione is. Glutathione is our body's main internal antioxidant that helps mop up free radicals, works together very closely with superoxide dismutase. And so that regeneration of glutathione so that it can function properly is dependent on NADPH, which also helps with detoxification, a respiratory burst, which is important for our immune response. And then this is another area that I really want to pause on for a moment, this deiodinase function. Deiodinase is the enzyme that converts inactive thyroid hormone, which is T4, to active thyroid hormone, which is T3. I've got a couple of slides on that briefly. But if you have a child who, one, has had their thyroid hormone checked and they have a low free T3 level, and you're trying to figure out why and trying to work on getting their T3 hormone elevated without the use of thyroid hormone, which in many cases is warranted. But again, the root cause here is really important. This thiamine dependent is an important factor in the production of NADPH, which is very important for deiodinase function of conversion of T4 to active T3. And then, of course, lipid synthesis. Fats, the brain is, 60% fats or more. Our cell membranes are very important on these lipids. Cholesterol synthesis, if you have a child with low cholesterol, which can have some other root causes, manganese being one of them. But if you have a child with low cholesterol, consider looking at potential for a B1 deficiency. So I've got a field of text here, kind of breaking a rule of PowerPoint presentations, but this was I couldn't really decide which part to pull out of this. This is from a review article from 2013, Thiamine Deficiency and Delirium. It's an excellent review of the pentose phosphate pathway and thiamine deficiency particularly. So it's a very important pathway. It occurs in the cytosol of human cells, meaning in the inner liquid of the cell, not within the mitochondria itself. And it's certainly important in the brain. It's an alternative pathway to glycolysis. Transketolase is an important enzyme, as I mentioned, with thiamine being the cofactor. And one of the important things produced here is NADPH. This is just corroborating a lot of the information I just said. NADPH plays an important role in the synthesis of glutathione, which is very important for preventing oxidative stress, converts hydrogen peroxide to water, and certainly impairment of this enzyme will create lots of free radicals, and those free radicals are very damaging to neurons within the brain. And so oxidative stress, as I'll point out later, has been linked to autism, many other neurodegenerative conditions. Parkinson's disease, if anybody out there has any family members with Parkinson's disease, look up the research on thiamine and Parkinson's disease. Other neurodegenerative conditions, Alzheimer's, right? They're looking at thiamine heavily. A lot of research to support thiamine in being helpful in neurodegenerative conditions. Many of my patients with Down syndrome, I'll present a case here in a little bit, that thiamine can play a role here. And so again, just a little bit more support here for NADPH, which, as you all now know, is important for is an important byproduct of the pentose phosphate pathway that's dependent on B1, and the diminished supporting activity of T3 neogenesis. The new production of T3 hormone was restored when they enriched their food of these animals. I believe this was a rat study, the rat liver here, with NADPH or glutathione. And this was further supported by some later research that indicated that it was actually NADPH was more rate limiting, and its effects appear to be rather direct, not just by glutathione formation alone, but directly supporting those T4 dehydrogenase enzymes, and of course the production of that active T3 hormone. So you may be wondering about active T3 hormone and this T4, T3. I wish I had time to go into the details of that, but just to touch upon that really quickly, the thyroid gland produces T4 hormone that is triggered to be secreted by TSH from the pituitary gland. But it's actually T3 hormone that is the active hormone that works within the cells of our body. T4, I'm going to say there's a little bit more that it does here, but it basically has no function within the cells of our body, and it needs to be converted to T3 hormone. And T3 hormone is a transcription factor. It literally docks onto the cells, the DNA within our cells, so that our cells can function. And every single cell of our body, especially the brain, is dependent on this active T3 hormone. This is a picture from Nature showing that mitochondria function also very dependent on T3 hormone. Again, some complicated processes here I'm not going to get into. This is the respiratory chain, oxidative phosphorylation, not only dependent on T3 hormone, but also T2 hormone, which is further produced by dehydrogenase enzymes. Again, really briefly, I just wanted to pick one thing to show you. I'm not going to read all of this text to you, how important thyroid hormone is in brain development and function. If you read anything out there, this work by Dr. Juan Bernal, he has several review articles online, information online about very in-depth information on the need for T3 hormone in the brain, right? They're essential for brain development through specific time windows, right? So its timing here is key, influencing neurogenesis, so the production of new neurons, neuronal migration, neuronal glial cell differentiation, myelination, right? The white matter within our brain is myelin. Synaptogenesis, those neurons connecting with one another, creating memories and learning, and it's mostly due to the interaction of active T3 hormone. So if you are working with a physician that is only looking at TSH, only looking at TSH and free T4, you're missing a huge part of the picture. It's really important to look at T3 hormone levels within the body as well. And of course, it's even more complicated than that. I'm not getting into reverse T3 here, but this process in a nutshell is very dependent on NADPH, which is dependent on thiamine and glucose metabolism. Okay, so causes of thiamine deficiency. Again, this is really key. It's important certainly to address the thiamine deficiency and give thiamine in the right form and the right dose, when it's warranted, but the root cause has to also be addressed. Arsenic is one of the main contributing factors to thiamine deficiency. And where do we get arsenic from? Unfortunately, it can be high in our food. Rice, particularly from Southeast Asia, areas of the United States where a lot of pesticide use was used, particularly in the southeast of the U.S., where pesticides that were heavy in arsenic were used for cotton crops. That arsenic does not go away. It remains in the environment, it remains in the soil, it leaches into the water. And rice, if you know about how rice is grown, is basically grown in the water, and it soaks up like a sponge any arsenic that is present there. So it's unfortunately a high source of arsenic, and this is very well established in research. Apple juice, particularly the seeds, is where the arsenic is concentrated, and those seeds, in the mass production of apple juice will get into the production of that juice and taint the juice with arsenic. Drinking water, again, in particular areas, Argentina, Bangladesh, Chile, China, India, Mexico, and areas of the U.S. I have a map here coming up in a little bit. Industrial processes, glass manufacturing. Here in my own city of Portland, Oregon, we had a stained glass manufacturer that was emitting toxic elements into the air that was falling into the neighboring houses. And it was a significant source of arsenic and other heavy metals. It was big news around here, and everyone, rightfully so, was concerned. And I believe that glass manufacturer is now out of business. Processing of pigments, textiles, papers, metal adhesive, wood preservatives, ammunition. Right. So think of the area that you live in. Someone in the household working in one of these industries, bringing residues home that can potentially be high in arsenic. Herbicides and pesticides, heavy in arsenic, certainly less so today, but herbicides and pesticides of the past, again, they do not just dissipate into the environment. They remain within the soil, and then eventually they get into our food. Tobacco smoke, this is kind of a basic level of health. Avoiding tobacco smoke is important, not only for the effects of the nicotine, but also the heavy metals, including arsenic, that can come with it. A map that might be helpful to some of you from 2010 showing the high risk areas for arsenic in drinking water. The Midwest in the U.S., you can see how high it is there. A lot of farming, a lot of food supply for the U.S. comes from the Midwest. And that's potentially the source of the arsenic. Some of it certainly does just occur naturally in the environment, in the soil. And so these areas of red here are a high risk for arsenic in the drinking water. You can potentially find out this information from your local environmental protection agency we have here in the U.S., but if you want to find more information about arsenic in the area, contact your local environmental government group. And so how does arsenic toxicity actually occur? This information is from a study. It inhibits that pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, as I mentioned, that is so important for glucose metabolism, right? If this enzyme doesn't work, none of this happens, basically. The citric acid cycle will completely be shut down if we don't have acetyl-CoA, and that pyruvic acid will build up and can lead to lactic acid, which is just going to be toxic to the brain, create muscle soreness, inhibit childhood development significantly. And then of course the other step of this cycle that will be inhibited is the alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase enzyme. Right, and that's specifically how arsenic toxicity works. So of course there are other causes, right? I focused on arsenic for a moment there. Acetaldehyde. This is another really important paper if you were to read anything outside of this. The pivotal role of aldehyde toxicity in autism spectrum disorder from 2015 is a really great review article on how these aldehydes are toxic in the body. Aldehydes are a byproduct of alcohol metabolism. So certainly we're going to see elevated aldehydes in alcoholism and candida overgrowth. And the connection here is really significant in that candida overgrowth, of course, is yeast within the gut. And if you know anything about how to brew beer or alcohol, yeast, is often used to make that alcohol. And so there is a condition, there's some research on this if you wanted to look it up, called auto brewery syndrome, where a person's body, if you have the right environment, enough candida and yeast overgrowth within the gut, and you add sugar to that person's internal, alimentary canal, they will make alcohol. And so this can happen in children who have candida overgrowth, and those aldehydes and that alcohol is not only toxic to the brain, but it inhibits thiamine absorption and utilization within the body. Of course, diets high in processed grains, white rice, white bread, not only just processed grains, but sugar, just diets high in sugar. If you have a child that will only eat crackers and bread and pasta and will not eat vegetables, the potential for thiamine deficiency in that child is really high. Sulfites can inhibit thiamine absorption. Again, this is from the kinetics of thiamine cleavage by sulfite. Sulfite is toxic to the body. What we need in our body is sulfate. So that self-oxidation enzyme that converts sulfite to sulfate is really important here. Of course, that enzyme is dependent on molybdenum. Diuretics will absolutely deplete thiamine. Diuretics are often used in children with heart disease when they're first born, congenital heart defects, pulmonary hypertension. They will often use diuretics in order to pull off that excess water. And when you pull off excess water, from the body, you're not only pulling off water, you're also pulling off, the body will be depleted of thiamine and magnesium, actually. Other diuretics include caffeine. So if you yourself as an adult happen to be a high consumer of caffeine or alcohol or any of these things that I'm talking about today, consider thiamine as something that might benefit you. Hyperthyroidism, which does occur, it's not as common as hypothyroidism, but hyperthyroidism will lead to a thiamine deficiency. This is from a study that was done in 2008, thyrotoxicosis, which is a form of hyperthyroidism. They found this in a case presenting that looked like Wernicke's encephalopathy, which is a form of thiamine deficiency we see in alcoholism, but this was a person that just had hyperthyroidism. So beriberi, right? So those are some causes of thiamine deficiency. Consumption of glucose, candida overgrowth being one of the most common, I believe, in children with autism and other special needs. Again, I can't get into the causes of that, but antibiotics and overuse of antibiotics, sometimes even as much as just one dose of antibiotics is enough to cause candida overgrowth in a child. But so those are some of the causes. So what does this look like in a patient? What does thiamine deficiency look like? How can we recognize it in our child or in our patients? So to look at beriberi specifically, there are two forms. It's called wet beriberi and dry beriberi. Wet beriberi is called that because it affects the cardiovascular system, so we will see increased fluid on the lungs, edema. So interesting that they use diuretics for pulmonary hypertension when that pulmonary hypertension, there's research to show, can be caused by thiamine deficiency. So the diuretics can potentially make that pulmonary hypertension worse. It will pull the fluid off and help it appear better, but the root cause can be aggravated by the diuretics. So we'll see peripheral vasodilation occurs, yielding high output cardiac failure. Progression of vasodilation is perceived by the kidney as a relative loss of volume. Right, so then the ensuing activation of the renin-angiotensin system produces greater salt and water retention. So we get edema, basically. And we'll see edema in children in their face, not as much in their legs. That more often occurs in adults. We'll see edema in their bellies. edema in the belly of a small child can be hard because children do tend to have little bellies, but it's important to really take a close look at the child and do good physical exams to really get a sense of whether the child is experiencing edema or not. So further fluid overload results in peripheral edema and pulmonary effusion, so we start to see fluid in the lungs. Dry beriberi affects the nervous system. That's more the symptoms I see in patients, but I do see wet beriberi. The sensory system is affected first, right? So your sensory system, how well the sensation of pain is. I do very thorough neuro exams on my patients as much as I can. Young children, it's very difficult. We'll do a little pinprick test on their hands and feet to make sure they can feel it. And then we'll start, once the sensory system is impacted, what we see next are the motor and autonomic systems. Motor neurons, of course, being fine motor skills, gross motor skills will be impaired. And then the autonomic nervous system is your automatic nervous system. So we see dysfunction in digestion. And there is gastrointestinal beriberi is another kind of form of beriberi, but I would say it's kind of related to this dry beriberi. We see decreased gut motility with a thiamine deficiency. So we'll start to see paresthesia, hyperesthesia, pins and needles, basically. A lot of diabetics actually are experiencing a thiamine deficiency. Again, look up the research, lots of it supporting thiamine, glucose metabolism, of course, and diabetes. So it usually begins with lower extremities, gradually involving the upper extremities, and then around the mouth, of course. So we'll see children with lots of oral stimulation needs. They'll tap their mouths or any kind of oral sensation difference with lots of chewing and things. It's a bit like if you went to the dentist and you got your gum numbed for that dental work, and then you just sort of tap your teeth, or it just feels a bit funny, kind of pins and needles. We'll see a lack of deep tendon reflexes, sometimes a complete loss. I try really hard to get these in my patients in the office. It's difficult to elicit deep tendon reflexes in children in general, but in children who are cooperative, I have seen a complete inability to get any response from their deep tendon reflexes, particularly their tendon, their patellar and their Achilles reflexes. Calf muscles can become painful. I haven't seen this in a lot of children, but this does happen in more in adults. Foot drop. I assess gait as closely as I can within the office, sometimes even putting my head on the ground to see if I can see if their feet are dropping just a little bit too early before they step down. We want to see a nice heel to toe step for children, and if they have a slap foot or their foot just kind of hits the floor, just that nervous system is not fully engaged into the foot. And then we'll see wrist drop. The case I present here in a little bit was a child who was experiencing significant wrist drop, and that's how I picked up her thiamine deficiency. Wrist drop is literally a limp wrist where the hands are held in a downward position. Signs and symptoms, here's what you're looking for, right? So in children, now many of my patients with Down syndrome, many of these symptoms are accepted as just, that's Down syndrome. But what if, right? What if some of those symptoms that they're experiencing are actually secondary to a thiamine deficiency, which again, I've picked up in many of my children with Down syndrome, and certainly you'll see many of these symptoms in children with autism as well. Low muscle tone. Right, low muscle tone is not a symptom to be ignored. It's often, again, accepted to be just, normal for Down syndrome, but really the important part there is to look for the root cause. Low muscle tone is not something to be ignored, because not only are we going to see low muscle tone is going to affect the skeletal muscular system, it's also going to affect the smooth muscle system, muscular system, and the gut, of course, is a muscle, and we'll see delayed gut motility, which will further impair absorption of nutrients and create a worsening of thiamine deficiency and other deficiencies as well. Hyporeflexia, as I mentioned, the deep tendon reflexes will be impaired, delayed gross motor skills, delayed speech. So, many of my patients are not verbal until much later. And so I want to hear from my parents when I ask them, with their 12 and 18-month old, they're at least starting to, babble and make some sounds. And, we've got their vocal cords are working basically. So we'll hear a hoarse voice, just a quiet baby, right? Ophthalmoplegia is definitely a symptom of a thiamine deficiency. There are other causes as well, other causes of low muscle tone, just mitochondrial dysfunction in general. But this thiamine is very important for mitochondrial function. Ptosis, which is a droopy eyelid, right? Either one eye or both eyes. So I really like to get a sense of just observing my patients as closely as I can. Crankiness and irritability. Now, this is difficult to assess in children sometimes, but if there's a general theme or a sudden increase in crankiness and irritability, it can be just that they don't feel well. Maybe they've got that muscle soreness, right? Think about how you feel after a hard workout and you're just sore the next day, or that muscle soreness can contribute to that crankiness and irritability. And that irritability can come from the fatigue. Right, when we're not getting energy from glucose, we are going to be tired, right? And we are potentially going to crave more glucose. And so children who are just craving those carbs and that sugar and that bread, especially ones who are craving it in an extreme way, it's possibly because they're just not metabolizing their glucose, so they're just craving more and more. Some of us adults listening to this can possibly relate. Certainly wrist drop, foot drop, I mentioned, tachycardia. This is part of the wet beriberi symptoms that we'll see. Low blood pressure, there's that pulmonary hypertension, and then poor growth, right? There are a lot of factors here involved in growth. Thyroid hormone being one of them, malabsorption of all nutrients, but a thiamine deficiency will definitely impair growth in children. Dysphagia, which is difficulty swallowing, again, those muscles, muscle tone, muscle innervation, being very dependent on thiamine. Constipation, there's the delayed gut motility that we can see with thiamine deficiency, and then frequent vomiting and spitting up. I have had families, parents who come to me, for an appointment, and one of their chief complaints can be reflux, or just, we often call it spitting up with children. It makes it sound very innocent, but if a child is 18 months, 2, 3 years old, and they're still quote unquote spitting up, to me that's, I interpret that more as sheer vomiting. And so thiamine can greatly increase the contractions of the stomach and gut motility in general, so that our food is moving southward instead of northward. And I have seen thiamine very quickly improve this symptom in patients. So if you have a child with cyclic vomiting syndrome or reflux or anything that looks like this, consider thiamine. I'll talk about how we dose and do that in a little bit. Many of the similar symptoms here we see in adults. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Wernicke's aphasia is a type of speech impairment. The Wernicke's area of the brain here that you see in the orange circle of the brain is one of the areas where speech is processed and is most strongly affected by a thiamine deficiency. So how do we detect a thiamine deficiency? Again, that red blood cell transketolase level is actually on the bottom there, not available in the US. That would be my preferred way of doing it. So we look at organic acid testing. Now you'll see on the right there, this is an actual result from a patient in my practice who clearly had a significant thiamine deficiency. We will see that elevated pyruvic acid, the mechanism of which should be clear to you by now, and elevated lactic acid. Do you see that lactic acid of 116? I've seen children with even higher levels, and this is a child that is in pain, right? That is not able to express it. That's going to create sore muscles, and that lactic acid is toxic to the brain. And so we want to pick these things up whenever possible. And I truly believe that organic acid testing is the #1 test that should be considered and done for children with special needs to detect some of this underlying metabolic dysfunction. And so the elevated lactic acid, of course, there's a review article, a study, etiology and therapeutic approach to elevated lactate. They talk about other causes for sure, but thiamine deficiency is definitely one to consider. We'll see an elevated level in those alpha-keto acids. This test result on this patient, there's the alpha-keto isovaleric acid was missing due to some interfering factor, possibly because it was too high to measure. But I had enough information here that this child received lactic acid, or excuse me, received thiamine, and then improved significantly in their development and gross motor skills afterwards. I'll talk about some other cases here in a minute. Plasma amino acids, specifically, we'll see elevated alanine, and then in the blood levels, we can also test lactate and pyruvate. I haven't found that serum lactate and pyruvate have been as helpful as these urinary organic acid tests in picking this up. With the blood draws, one of the interfering factors can be if a child is struggling as well. And so that excess struggling during the blood draw creates some muscle tension and energy production, and it can falsely elevate a lactate. So I find it sometimes not as helpful as this urine test. So those are some labs that we run, again, that organic acid testing being key here. Now, I have had patients who have had normal lactate pyruvate levels within their organic acid test, and I'll still, just because of their symptoms and it's a very safe supplement to use, I'll still recommend some thiamine. So how does this relate to autism, right? I thought about starting with this information to kind of draw you in, to show you that there's a role here of thiamine in autism, but I wanted to get some of the biochemistry out of the way first. So again, this is an excellent review article, The Role of Thiamine in Autism. It talks quite a bit about the biochemistry and further research that has been done. I highly recommend that you find it online and take a look at what they say here. There is a role because of the importance of thiamine in the brain. And this can happen in young children. One of the tables from this article, there's a lot of information here. I'm not going to go over specifically. One of the areas they talk about is oxidative stress. It's been well established that oxidative stress is a factor in autism. Oxidative stress can be very damaging to neurons, and we see here that benfotiamine, which is my preferred form of thiamine that I recommend in my practice, it inhibits COX-2 expression, and COX-2, as you may or may not know, is an important part of the inflammation process, and inflammation we want to reduce in many cases with autism. Lipid peroxidation is often elevated in a thiamine deficiency. And then the second part of this table, here we talk about the pyruvate dehydrogenase and its implications in autism and some of the enzymes here in brain function. You can pause this and read through this if you'd like, or take a look at that article online. So mitochondrial dysfunction in autism, also well supported by research. And so what these researchers found here is higher plasma pyruvate levels. Again, you know that now that pyruvate levels, when they're elevated, it's because that pyruvate dehydrogenase complex is not working. And so they found higher pyruvate levels in children with autism compared with controls. 8 of 10 cases had higher pyruvate levels, but only 2 cases had higher lactate levels compared with controls. The pyruvate levels alone, that's enough. So if you look at these together, almost all of their cases then had a need for thiamine. I don't quote any information from this article. The title alone says it all. It's a very in-depth review article, again, of thiamine biochemistry and how the cell metabolism is dependent on it. And so update of cell damage mechanism in thiamine deficiency, focus on oxidative stress, excitotoxicity, and inflammation. Some of those words may be familiar to you if you're familiar with autism at all, and some of the other mechanisms that have been connected to autism. These are definitely at play here. Evidence linking oxidative stress, again, mitochondrial dysfunction and inflammation in the brain of individuals with autism, right? And you see how thiamine now can be a factor here. The brain regions found to contain these physiological abnormalities in individuals with autism spectrum disorder are involved in speech and auditory processing, social behavior, memory, and sensory and motor coordination. So if we can, this was from Dr. Rossignol and Dr. Richard Fry, two clinicians, neurologists, and researchers in the area of autism doing some really great work. And so these mechanisms that they discuss here, again, can be rooted in a thiamine deficiency. Now, I'm not recommending that anybody only address thiamine deficiency in a patient, right? It would be rare for a patient to only be experiencing thiamine deficiency. I would say it's rare for it to probably happen in isolation, but it's definitely a significant one. And again, I'll get into dosing here is key. So here's Dr. Lonsdale's work, some of his work. I mentioned him previously. So they did a study where they treated children with a form of thiamine called thiamine tetrahydrofuryl disulfide, TTFD for short. They did use them as rectal suppositories to make it easier. The taste of this form of thiamine is not pleasant, and so what they found from these subjects, again, 10 children, that 8 of the 10 children improved clinically. So that to me right there is significant. So if you have a child with autism and you want to try some thiamine to see if it's a factor, again, don't ignore root cause. Work with a physician who understands some of those root causes and how to treat them properly. Again, doing a trial of thiamine is something that is definitely safe and definitely can be considered. So Down syndrome and thiamine deficiency. This is where the majority of the work that I do with patients is in those with Down syndrome. And many people might think, well, what can you do with a child with Down syndrome? There's an extra chromosome. That's a big obstacle. But many of these children are actually experiencing gastrointestinal issues, malabsorption secondary to those gastrointestinal issues, and if we can get to the root cause of those and try to optimize absorption and reverse these nutritional deficiencies that they do experience, we can see often some big changes in their development. Again, I have a case coming up here in just a moment. So within this study, it was from 1979. If you do look up this study, the text of this study, I do have to give the caveat that it is very berating. It was written in 1979, and the dialogue at that time around children with Down syndrome was unfortunately fairly derogatory. However, the information that they did gain from this study of 3 adults with Down syndrome, I hesitate to call it a study, it was only 3 adults. It's unfortunate that this was not repeated because their findings were significant. Subject 1, they did see far less stubborn and negativistic. Again, he or she probably felt better. And then when they took them off the thiamine 6 months later, they returned to being uncooperative and tended to be isolated. Patient number 2 was far less depressed and spoke more spontaneously and was no longer weepy, which is really probably just felt better on the thiamine. I hope they continue them on the thiamine after they took them off. And again, patient number 3 here was more cooperative, friendly, and it resolved this patient's violent outbursts. Now, as you can imagine, that would be for some patients and some families, that would be a really nice effect if you did have a patient that was experiencing some violent outbursts. Thiamine was shown here to be positive in adults with Down syndrome, again, which can be very difficult to impact brain physiology in adulthood, but it is possible. This is a case. I hate to call it a case, but this is an example of a 14-month-old little girl. She presented to me via telehealth appointment. I was actually seeing her sister who had Down syndrome, and the mother brought her daughter. We had a few more minutes at the end of our appointment, and her daughter was 14 months old at the time, and she said, "Will you take a look at my daughter? No one will help me. No one will. She was seeing doctors, she was seeing pediatricians, and they all told her, just give her time. Just give it time. It will happen. Her development will happen, because she was 14 months old. And this, you guys, this might, just this little window I saw of what I believe is happening with, a lot of very busy pediatric offices. They have, 5, 10, 15-minute appointments if you're lucky, and it's very difficult for primary care physicians to pick up some of these in-depth biochemical things in patients, and a lot gets missed. They're human. They're only using what they've learned in medical school, and unfortunately a lot gets missed. And so this little girl was about to fall through the cracks. So what I saw immediately, this was just through a computer screen, lack of expression. She was 14 months old. This was the parent's chief complaint, was that she just was not laughing or smiling or emoting in any way. And I saw it right away. She had low muscle tone, immediately noticeable. She wasn't crawling, certainly wasn't walking, and she wasn't making any sounds either. And so not using her hands, infrequent laughing or smiling, only interacting with parents, but even minimally. She was breastfed, and she had started eating some purees, and this was the clincher. She had a rash all over her body, off and on since birth. And again, the physicians kind of dismissed the connection with the rash and her lack of development, and they had been recommending topical steroid creams, and this was a rash all over her body. That's a lot of steroid cream for a child that size and age to be absorbing. And so I recommended that we run an organic acid test. She was only 14 months old. I didn't want to just make assumptions here, but what I saw about that rash, it looked like she probably had candida overgrowth, and I wasn't aware at the time. This is how I learned. This was the little girl that prompted my learning of all this. And then she had a thiamine deficiency secondary to that. So the parents have given me permission to show you some pictures here today. This is her daughter with Down syndrome, who we've been working with. She was quite healthy, doing really well. And then this is her younger daughter, who she was concerned about. Again, expressionless. There's the wrist drop. Do you see that? As soon as I saw that again on the camera, I knew that we were dealing with a neurological issue, potentially CP, and I told the mother that she needed to see a neurologist ASAP, get a CAT scan, MRI, etc. And the mom did not receive a lot of help, unfortunately, from the neurologist. They were looking at genetic things, and again, I think she was just too young, and they were just waiting for development. But this wrist drop to me was significant. Okay. And so again, the topical steroids told mother not to worry about development. It would happen eventually. I kid you not, that's exactly what the mother shared with me. So we ran the organic acid test. This was in July of 2016, and this is what came up. This was not a surprise to me. However, this was the highest arabinose level I had ever seen. She had significant yeast overgrowth, right? Many different markers of indicating yeast overgrowth, particularly that arabinose level. 8 times the highest level there. Hippuric acid, again, extremely elevated bacterial overgrowth in her gut. 4-hydroxyphenylacetic acid, which can be an indicator of not only C. diff and Clostridia, but just bacterial overgrowth in general. So this, to me, looked like delayed gut motility, but that yeast was creating a big problem. Oxalates were extremely high, as you can see, 1,321. I don't think I've seen an oxalate level higher than that since this patient. And then her lactic acid, again, I have not seen a lactic acid this high. It was 480. This little girl was not smiling because she was sore and she was in pain and unable to tell anybody. Succinic acid was elevated, malic acid. She was so mitochondrial dysfunction, right? So not only was she experienced a thiamine deficiency, there was also signs of riboflavin deficiency and probably many other. I'm not going to go into the great detail of the whole organic acid test here. But basically I knew that we had to get in there and get that candida out of there. And I shared with the mother some information about thiamine deficiency, beriberi, wrist drop, to share with her doctors. And even presented with this research and this information, they still weren't helpful. I wanted her to get IV thiamine immediately, but they were rejecting that possibility. And I think that physicians today just are not taught the role that vitamins have within the body, and that the potential for vitamin deficiency occurs in children today in developed countries in the United States, and it's not being recognized. So we started her on nystatin. There are many other ways that you can choose to treat candida. There are natural, grapeseed extract, oregano oil, biocidin is a product I use a lot with patients, but with this little girl I wanted to get in there and get it out quickly. And so we chose nystatin. Chose a fairly high dose for her age, 25 billion, multi-strain probiotic. I chose lactoferrin as a source of addressing biofilm, some ribocarnicocQ10, again, mitochondrial support, Enhanza to reduce inflammation, anti-candida diet, and then I referred to the geneticist and neurologist, and they ultimately weren't helpful. Now at this time, I was not aware of the lactic acid and thiamine connection, again, because it wasn't taught to me in medical school. It wasn't until later that I found information about that. I'll tell you how that went. So we repeated the test in January of 2017. Based on just that alone, we didn't even address thiamine yet. And because we chose nystatin to treat her yeast markers were greatly down, and then her bacterial markers were elevated. So again, I knew we were dealing with gut motility because things were still backed up. We just shifted the flora, and I knew that we had to work on gut motility, which is heavily dependent on the nervous system, and thiamine. Her oxalates were greatly reduced, but still there, again, with treating the yeast. Mitochondrial metabolites were improving, but we still had some work to do there. And then I think I came across some information, I can't remember how exactly I came across it, but I saw the wrist drop as a symptom of beriberi. And right away, I thought of this patient, and I contacted mom immediately. And I had recommended Othia cream at the time because she was young, and I thought, just using a topical would be sufficient. There was 50 milligrams of B1 in 1 ml. We also upped her B vitamins, recommending a B complex. I focused a little bit more on riboflavin at the time, some oxvile because I was worried about fat absorption, and then we switched from nystatin to biocidin to then further treat the bacteria. Wasn't as effective as I would have liked, the Othia cream, and I still believe that to this day. I haven't seen, it's a great product, using it topically. I don't mean to downplay the company and what they're using here, but I find once you clear the root cause of the thiamine absorption, which is often candida overgrowth, you can get some oral supplementation in. And so then we added benfotiamine, 100 milligrams once a day was added to her plan. So I went high here. It's very safe, non-toxic form of B1, and this is where we saw the spark. She started using her hands. She still has some wrist drop here, but she wasn't even using her hands before. Started feeding herself, and she started smiling. I think she most likely felt better, and potentially her muscles were even working better so that she could smile. So we still have some healing to go with her. We're still kind of watching some of this organic acid testing and gut motility, and gut being really key here. And so I'm still working with this family and this little girl. But once we started that oral benfotiamine, it was a significant improvement in her development. And this is what the mom wrote. She's doing great things. She's so engaged, laughing so much, making lots of sounds during the day when she passes things to me or as part of talking exchange. She's seeing steady progress with gross motor too. Lots faster, more active, climbing on the chair, crawling on the steps of swing steps, standing on tiptoes to reach. So we had started about a year prior, and she was not. Certainly development is going to happen, and these things are going to happen, but they happen much more rapidly once we started that B1. This is the story of a 4-year-old boy with significant motor delay. Now, he happened to have Down syndrome. I neglected to write that here. I sometimes ignore that my patients have Down syndrome and I just look at their symptoms and I see them as a child first. He did have significant gross motor delays. Now, he was 4 years old and he still was not walking and crawling was limited. Something significant was happening with this little boy that was not, quote unquote, just Down syndrome. He was nonverbal. He had very low energy. The mother reported that he was happy, engaged, but often grumpy, would sometimes just lay around and cry. These are words that I pulled from my notes. The mother tried many supplements, but none made a significant difference. She even tried some that were specifically marketed and designed for Down syndrome, and they did not work on this little boy because he had something extra going on. So this family finally decided to run an organic acid test. This is from a different company. The one previously was from Great Plains Lab. This one is from Genova Diagnostics. And so I had repeatedly asked them if we could run this test without kind of pushing it because it's a great expense to many families. But for them, it was worth every penny because it picked up his thiamine deficiency. He was in ketosis, which I'm not a fan of at all for children. You may be looking at a ketogenic diet for your child, but I recommend that you work on optimizing glucose metabolism, not ketogenesis. That is a significant metabolic shift for a child that can limit growth. Ketones are acidic. It's not ketogenesis in children is not something to just do lightly at home. But he was in ketosis, partly from diet and partly just because he wasn't metabolizing his glucose. And so his alpha keto acids, again, very elevated, an interfering factor here for isoketovaleric acid, potentially because it was, again, too high to measure. He also had markers here for riboflavin deficiency, but they were not as significant as his need for B1. So what I did was at the time I recommended a B complex that had 25 milligrams of thiamine hydrochloride. Other supplements were recommended, of course. I'm not getting into the details of his whole case here. And we didn't see any significant changes in his gross motor skills. And then it was a few months later in February of 2017 that I saw a video online of him walking. And I'm going to show you that video here in a moment. And right away I knew that we were off. We weren't on the right track. So I contacted the mother outside of an appointment. I contacted her once I got caught up here, and I recommended that she switch to benfotiamine and at 150 milligrams per day. Again, right away, he started crawling more, walking independently, making attempts at more speech within a few months. Now remember, he was 4 years old. He was many years behind, several years behind in his development and walking, and it wasn't until we started this B1 that we saw some pretty rapid turnaround. So here's the video of his story with a little bit of text. I'll just talk over this. So this was again in February of 2017 when he was on only 25 milligrams. And you can see the redness in his feet here. They're trying to get him to walk on this treadmill, and he is just about paralyzed in his feet. That redness is a sign of neuropathy, and he's not using his feet. So then we started in March of 2017, 150 milligrams of benfotiamine. By July, the mother sent out another video, and he had started walking. And actually what she had said in July was that he started walking more in May. So it was only a few months that his legs started working. And then by September of 2017, he was walking a lot. His nervous system is starting to heal. Again, we still have some work to do. And not only was he walking, but he was taken off. And so that elevated lactic acid, for a significant amount of time, unfortunately can have some long-term effects on the brain. But I truly believe in the brain's ability to heal, and we will continue to work with these patients who have a history of these nutrient deficiencies. So treating a thiamine deficiency, now that you know some of the biochemistry, why a thiamine deficiency causes problems, symptoms of it, labs to run and look for, how to recognize it in a patient, basically. You need to treat the root cause, right? And it can be many things. It can be all these things for children. Candida overgrowth, the sulfites I mentioned, diet, right? A high sugar, high carb diet, and then arsenic, unfortunately. And benfotiamine is my preferred choice. There's also allithiamine. It's non-toxic. Benfotiamine, in my experience, doesn't have a lot of flavor, although I've had families open capsules during appointments, when they're at home on the computer and tell me that it did not taste good. But it's still, worth trialing with your child whether it tastes bad or not. And some adults are reporting feeling better using 300, 600 milligrams. Dr. Lonsdale talks about some rare cases where he needed to use upwards of 3 to 5,000 milligrams. I certainly wouldn't go that high, but I often recommend anywhere from 75 to 150 milligrams, depending on the age of the child. B complex, right? Again, it's rare that a B1 deficiency would happen in isolation. The form of B complex I prefer right now is from Clear Labs. It's called their active B complex, and it has benfotiamine, ribose 5-phosphate, pyridoxal 5-phosphate, methylcobalamin, etc. Magnesium, right, works together synergistically with B1. The forms I prefer are glycinate, malate, and threonate. Alpha lipoic acid in small doses. You always want to use R-lipoic acid. It's the active form. And then don't be afraid to, in patients when it's warranted, especially with gut issues, if you want to bypass the gut and get that B1 in quickly, don't be afraid to use IV or intramuscular B1 B complex when warranted. I wish I could do that with more of my patients, but I do a lot of telemedicine. Okay, so prognosis, right? We've got some published cases of adults who have experienced thiamine deficiency. Again, healing of the brain in children is much easier than in adults, but it has even been documented to occur and result in adults. So B1 deficiency causes what's called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome in alcoholics who have been consuming alcohol for long periods of time and generally accepted to be irreversible. But here are some published cases with aggressive treatment of B1. It's a 52-year-old man with a 10-year history of heavy alcohol abuse, was admitted to the hospital. He was ataxic, ocular motor symptoms, right? There's that nystagmus and strabismus, eyes shaking or crossing, promptly reversed following standard treatment, but no change was observed in higher mental functioning, right? So it wasn't until they started giving him 600 milligrams a day and 300 milligrams a day intramuscularly, they fully reversed the condition within 2 months. Right, this was a 52-year-old man. So this to me shows that if you have a child whose autism or developmental delays are rooted in thiamine deficiency, it is potentially fully reversible. Potentially. Another case of a 40-year-old man transferred to the drug alcohol unit from the emergency department with a 25-year history of regular alcohol consumption, and he was diagnosed with Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. He was administered 1,000 milligrams of thiamine hydrochloride via IV, so not even like the active form. And they administered this for 5 days. And they started to see a restriction of eye movements were no longer prominently present. And on the 6th day of treatment, they switched him over to 100 milligrams of oral thiamine, and within 3 weeks, his walking improved, his ataxia, his balance improved, his orientation to time, place, and person was intact, and by 4 weeks, it's 1 month, you were unable to find any of the symptoms. He was able to find his way back around the city, and he was home and left on home leave for a couple of days. So this was a man who was significantly impacted by a thiamine deficiency, and it was reversed within a month. So my final thoughts about thiamine deficiency. Doing thorough neuro exams or getting your doctor to do if you have a child with autism or Down syndrome or other special needs, and you go into a doctor's office and they're not checking reflexes or not doing pinprick tests or not looking at craniofacial nerves, that's not a thorough neuro exam. And including deep tendon reflexes, I don't think I've ever had one of my families who has a child with Down syndrome tell me that, yeah, their doctor was regularly checking their deep tendon reflexes. We need to be looking at these. Gait analysis, eye exam, sensation, etc. And then organic acid testing. The amount of information that we pick up from organic acid testing is vast. I just showed you a few sections of each of these tests. It's a vast amount of information that we get from organic acid testing. It's obviously different than a stool analysis. Stool analysis, we will pick up what is happening in the colon. We are not picking up nutritional deficiencies, what's happening in the small intestine, and so we'll miss things if we're just doing stool analysis. Definitely considering history here, not just current symptoms in labs, right? Ask about what the patient's diet was 2 years ago or what it's been in the past. And lastly, my final thoughts, the brain and the nervous system can heal. There are stem cells within the brain, the peripheral nervous system can heal, and never give up, right? Always keep searching for the answer. It's out there, right? Thiamine deficiency might be an answer for your child. It might not be, right? But there is an answer out there, and we just need to find it. And hopefully you're working with a physician who is not willing to give up and is willing to help support you and find the answers for your child. So I appreciate your attention today, and I hope you found this information helpful. If you would like more information about my practice, I have a lot of information on my blog. We are at pearsoncenter.com, and I wish you much luck and healing on your journey with your child. Thank you so much for your attention.